Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Is bad teaching tearing the U.S. apart? Well, on the International Adult Literacy Survey, Americans went from being number one for children who were educated in the 1950s to fifth for those in the 70s and 14th in the 90s. And things have only gotten worse. Between 2002 and 2015, American school children went from ranking of 15th to 24th in the reading on the Program for International Student Assessment. Things are going downhill. And the question today, is it bad teaching? Be very clear here. Teaching. Didn't say teachers. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is what is the cause of the education crisis that we face? The reality of, despite our best efforts and many good intentions, things not panning out the way that any of us would like for them to. And that's across the board, America falling behind in the educational space. But a conversation on education and the American way would not be complete without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
I've spent multiple years as a student and as a teacher, so I'm very passionate about education from both the student aspect and the teaching aspect. Have some strong opinions. I have 40 years as an educator, as someone who has practiced the art of teaching. But using some words there that we're going to turn the word of the day over to my co-host, and that is Justin. He has a couple of words that he wants to define for the audience, because we're really big on the State of Us of saying we need to work from the same set of facts. So today we're going to work from the same set of definitions. So Justin, what are the two words that you want to make the words of the day?
So our two words today are teach, which is a verb, and the present participle version, teaching. And the second word is educate. And these are often used interchangeably, right? We're teaching kids. We're educating kids. Those are the same thing. Well, let's listen to the definitions. So teach as a verb means to show or explain to someone how to do something. Okay. By contrast, educate, which is also a verb, is give intellectual, moral, and social instruction to someone, especially a child, typically at a school or university.
Those aren't the same things. I mean, if you have to, if you listen to this and then all of a sudden, stop it and go back and listen, those definitions, those words do not mean the same thing. They're both very important in the school system, in the public school system, but they do not mean the same things.
No, I mean, I think the biggest difference there, right, is teach has more to do with demonstrating how to do something, right? Show someone how to do something or how to complete a given task, where educate is about giving intellectual, moral, and social instruction to someone, typically at a school. So the reason that I think that that's important, Lance, other than the semantics difference of that, is it helps frame our conversation, because really what we're looking at are three kind of fundamental questions today to answer the question, is bad teaching tearing the U.S. apart? First, and this is what we'll talk about in this segment, is it possible to spark curiosity inside of a curriculum, right? And that's why we're going to be very careful with our words today. Note that we said curriculum. Second segment, standardized learning. Does standardized learning make teachers bad, or do bad teachers ruin standardized learning? Third segment, can you have higher wages and more respect for teachers and have higher teacher accountability? So that's kind of our structure today. They're each hopefully going to build into each other. But that first one, curriculum, and you and I talked about this before the show, right, Lance? The idea that we use, just like we use educate and teach interchangeably, we use curriculum and standardized kind of interchangeably. But to somebody like you, they're not the same thing, right?
That's true, because Standardized to me means that we're all going to work from the same model, and we have to follow that model no matter whether student A is in my history class or your history class. They're going to receive the same treatment. They are going to be taught the same words. They're going to have the same lessons. They're going to be presented the same, because that is what we do when we're going to standardize it. Okay. But what the other way is, okay, here are the standards that we want met. These are the things that we want student A to learn. And we're going to allow Lance to do it the way that they feel is best. And we're going to allow Justin to do it the way they feel best. And so therein is the difference. And that to me, it doesn't maybe seem like a lot, but it really is, because when you think of education, and this is one of the big arguments, and not to get us off track so soon, because I think you bring up 3 very interesting questions for us to discuss today. But today's teachers are trained as teaching being a science, and I was trained as teaching as an art. And I think then that is where, if it's a science, well, then if you do the same thing to the same lab rats, then you look for the same thing, the same outcome. And I don't think that that's education. I think education is to teach means to bring the differences in that you need to bring in to reach the different lab rats, i.e. the students, the people that are sitting in front of you and the young minds. And so there is what I think the difference, if that makes sense. If not, please ask or let me know.
We didn't talk about why this is so important today, this topic, but I would hope that it's obvious, right? I mean, if we go from number one in literacy for children down to 24th in the time span of 70 years, supposedly society is getting more advanced, and yet we're getting, and this is not going to be, whatever socially acceptable term, but we're getting dumber. Right. And not the capability of people is any less. Their education is less. And that is really important to understand. I'm not saying that they're inherently right, that the people are inherently dumb. It's that we are not giving them the same rigor or the same understanding of what makes education. And that's why we want people's thoughts today, because we want you thinking. Hopefully that's part of how not only Lance and I are going to learn, but also you're going to learn, is if you think about what we're saying and get back to us. And they can send us an email, right, Lance?
Right. I mean, if what we say sparks a thought in your mind, please share it with us at podcast@thestateofus.org.
You can send us an email. We like to hear from you. We've heard from a number of different people who've given us pretty lengthy answers. And education, Lance and I really had to rein it in today, because when you start talking about things like this, you could go down individual rabbit holes. But to answer that question, right, Lance, of is it possible to spark curiosity inside of a curriculum? I think the answer is yes, and here's why. The definitions again here. If we understand these and we think about what they really mean, curriculum is a noun, and it refers to the subjects comprising a course of study in a school or college, right? The subjects comprising. Now, if we define standard, the second definition is what best fits, and it says an idea or thing used as a measure or model in comparative evaluations. So they're not even the same. Using them interchangeably is not even really appropriate, because they talk about different things, right? Standard is how we measure something, right? Measure student success. Curriculum is how we teach. And if we focus maybe less on standardized learning and more on curriculum learning, saying, Lance, here's the subjects that we need you to teach to your students. You figure out how to teach it, how to educate your students on it.
And that's what we've always talked about as a practicing teacher and as a practicing educator, is that what is it that you want me to do? And I saw that change throughout my 40 years in the teacher side of education, 55 years of me being in the school system. I started when I was 4. So I've been in the education system as either a student or a teacher, and at some points both. on multiple occasions. It has really changed to the point that teachers are saying, well, what do you want us to do? And so if we give you a standardized test, well, then obviously I have to teach to the test. But then it's harder to be creative and meet the needs of my students, because my students may be interested in an event that's not covered on the standardized test. But I can use that event to teach the thought processes that are needed to be able to be a good citizen or to be an effective lifelong learner. And so that's the conundrum that many educators are in today, is that they are graded on, not to get into our third segment, but teachers are graded on how well their students do on these standardized tests. So they feel pressure to go over the material that's on the test and not necessarily go over the material that interests their students, which they could use to creatively meet the standards of the curriculum. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's where we were and where we've gone. We used to be able to say, okay, we want students to learn American history. We want you to make sure you hit these points. Okay. Then it was up to me as the leader of the classroom to determine how we were going to get there. But when we introduced and with No Child Left Behind and said every student has to be exposed to this material, then it limits those educational forays by the student and the teacher to learn the things that interest them, as well as learning the skills that are necessary to be successful.
And that's part of why I want people to think about, I wrote this down as you were speaking, Lance, right? We need to teach students how to read, right? A rigor, a manner of making sure they understand the process of reading.
Reading is a skill. So it must be taught. It must be practiced. So there is a way to learn reading. And then like any other skill, you must practice it to get better at it. Whether you're learning to play the piano, there's a method or methods to learning to play the piano. Or if you're learning a sport, or if you're baking, right? If you're cooking, there are rules you have to follow and skills you must master. And the more you practice it, the better you get. And that's what reading is. Reading is a skill.
So we need to teach reading. We need to educate students on life skills, right? Educate on problem solving. And I was just making this observation when you were thinking, Lance. I want people to think about this as we go into the next segment. If you've been listening to the show for a while, even not that long, you would know that Lance refers to himself and even his introduction, typically not as I have been a teacher for 35 years. I have been an educator for 35 years. Small distinction, but I think a big difference, especially when you listen to the words, right? How would it change the conversation if we all understood what educate meant versus teach? And when we're asking, it's almost like we need a different word than educate or teach, because your teachers, your educators ideally should be doing both, but they're not the same. And that's where I think we make the mistake, is we believe that we're only here to teach skills, or we are only here, right, to spark creativity and passion for knowledge. And while I think both are true, that's the conundrum. And that's what leads us into the next question of, is standardized learning making teachers bad? Or are bad teachers ruining standardized learning? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
As we think about educating students and as we think about teaching them, they're different things. We must teach students the basic skills they need to become educated, to live a lifelong process of educating themselves. And I think that's why this topic's so important to me, Lance, is having been somebody that, went through high school and was going to go the very traditional route of going into college and then dropped out of college and left college. I have been very focused, I feel like, in my adult life on, and part of it because of this show forces me to do that, right? To educate myself on an ongoing basis on topics and ideas. I don't do a lot of self-teaching. I do a lot of self-educating. And that made me think about, right, this idea of standardized learning and bad teachers. Because we all know, right, there are bad teachers, but why are they bad? Well, in some cases, they get into it for the wrong reasons, right? We'll set that group aside because that's kind of its own thing, and that's not really the focus of today's show. It sort of is in the last segment, but in this segment, it's more about the concept of what's making bad teaching, right? Because it's not necessarily you have bad teachers, but have you boxed them in a way that there's no way out? So the question, Lance, being, is it possible, standardized learning, does it make teachers bad, or do bad teachers ruin standardized learning? In other words, have we just not equipped teachers to be able to teach and educate well with inside standardized learning? Is that the problem? Or is it that standardized learning ruins the capacity of teachers?
The vast majority of teachers are very caring, good people who want what's best for their students, and they're very passionate about what they teach, and they want their students to learn it, and they want to meet their students where they are and get them to help them to learn and achieve at the highest level possible. Unfortunately, many of us in education today feel like our hands are tied by the standardized curriculum and what we are being taught and how we are being how they want us to teach it and how they evaluate us, the higher ups that evaluate us. And so I am going to come down on the side of that. What we do today handcuffs the teachers into doing a better job. They see it, but they're not allowed to deviate. And when they deviate, it is then looked down upon, and they run into trouble with administrators who have been told this is what has to be done because we have to make sure each student gets the lesson in the same way. Yet, by the same token, we read educational manuals that tell us everybody learns differently. And as you were talking, what I was thinking of, yeah, Justin, you're a lifelong learner. And as an educator, that's what I want. I want students to leave my classroom and to want to continue to learn. No matter what it is. And then I think about early in my career, the first half of my career, all teachers seemed to be respected, and the students liked every teacher. I mean, they liked the science teachers. They liked history teachers. They liked the art teacher. They liked the music teacher. The last 10 to 12 years of my career has been students really connect with what they call the specials. They connect with the teachers that are, and I'm talking about high school age students because that's what I spent the majority of my career doing. They connect with the music teacher, with the choir teacher, the art teacher, the foreign language teacher. And why is that? Well, because they don't have the rigor of sticking to a set curriculum that the math, science, English, and social studies teachers do. That's been the big change in education in the last 15 to 20 years. Where do students feel comfortable in the classroom, where they're allowed to express their interest? It's encouraged, and the teacher can accept them from where they are and take them to where they want to go. And in your 4 basic subjects, the teachers have been told by the state, this is what we're going to evaluate you on. Therefore, you need to get your students to learn this information in this way. And it's taken away the art of educating young people in that manner. Then it's caused us, as if you were a scientist, to look at your hypothesis. We have gotten worse on the world stage. So obviously that way's not working, but we're continuing to do more of it, to mandate even more of it, and we're continuing to get lessening returns.
That's exactly what I was thinking as you were speaking, is this whole idea, right, of if we care about the data, and I think, Lance, the nation's always been divided. How we deal with our division, how we weed out the information, how we have conversations. I do think that has degraded, at least in my lifetime. It feels like it has. Maybe it hasn't actually. Maybe it's just a, perception issue. And I've talked some about, I think social media has amplified our ability to see the divisions that we have. At the same time, I also think that because we are a less intellectually curious people, we suffer also from a desire to find simple answers. And that all comes back to this, right? Because we talk about, well, why do you care? Because, you're listening and it's like, okay, we're talking about curriculums and standardize. And that's, to me, that's the big picture, right? That's what puts us in the situation we're in. And you ask, how can people storm the Capitol, right? They are starved intellectually. They're searching, right? They find these conspiracy theories. They find these things that aren't true, and they're searching. And instead of finding good quality conversation and debate, we send people down these dark places that they don't have the skills to get out of. These sorts of things happen when you are no longer giving people open minds and large souls, because that's not what we do. We say there's this nice little box, and if you can do the things inside of this box, then you'll be good. And to me, Lance, I don't know about you, that sounds an awful lot like socialism. Shut up, sit down, do what you're told, and you'll have an okay life. If you want to think big, don't, because that's not how we succeed. We succeed if we all do the same thing the same way. Again, we've talked about, I think socialism has some moral merits to it, but that doesn't sound like how we grew to become the nation we are. Just to me.
I don't agree with you there, but I think what we have is we had a situation back in the 1960s and 70s when I was in school where we had a wide gap between what students were learning in the public education system. And we've continued to try to lessen that gap. And what we've done is we've widened the gap. The bottom line is we used to prepare kids in a better fashion for the world than we do now. The education that your children and your soon-to-be grandchildren are going to get is not the same education you got. And it's amazing. I just had a former student call and talk to me for an hour and a half on Friday because they were frustrated. This isn't the way it was when I was in school. And I said, their daughters are both in, high school now. And I said, remember, I told you that 10 years ago when your oldest started school. I said, it's not the same school that you went to. They're not going to get the same education that you got. And that's their frustration. It's not that it's socialist, but it's not teaching them what they need to know. And that is, it's not teaching them how to think and how to problem solve. They're learning a set of information that then they regurgitate on a standardized test. And that's where we're falling short. That was what our goal was. Our goal was to teach children skills and then educate them to be good problem solvers and figure out how to be lifelong learners.
To clarify my point, because as I'm thinking about it, what you said, what I'm referring to is the idea that the only thing that matters are teaching to the same standards, right? A universal principle. And here's where this is going to sound like a conundrum to people, right? Because I advocated, we have to make sure that people know how to read, right? We have to do a better job of making sure people know how to do basic math, because I'll be the first to tell you that my math education is wholly inadequate, right? Not in that I didn't do advanced math classes, because by God, I sat in Algebra 2 and learned about imaginary numbers. I don't know what the hell that has to do with anything in my everyday life, but I can't tell you off the top of my head what 9 times 6 is. That to me,
54.
That's right. There you go. That's the problem. Okay.
Because I had to learn that. We had drills. We had worksheets that we did every day in class in 2nd and 3rd grade. And we had weekly contests in 4th grade at the board. We're in front of people and you had to, oh my gosh, can you imagine today if you had a room contest with multiplication facts and division facts in front of the whole room, and student C didn't win, and you ruined their little self-esteem and all that kind of stuff? No, I mean, it made you study harder because you wanted to do well. And then it stays with you to this day. You plug numbers into the calculator and we're having business meetings and I'm giving you either the exact answer or a pretty close ballpark figure.
That's the conundrum, right, that we run into, but that people have to understand. We can say things like, we want kids to have a holistic education and they need to be able to do their multiplication tables, and they need to be able to read. And the problem is, like so many things in society, and this is my referral to the socialist comment, we've opted for the all one way thing, right? That we just want the people to fit in the box. That's what I'm talking about. And again, it's not an attack on socialism, because I know there's lots of people that would say we'd have a more inclusive and better society, but that comes at a cost. And here, your education comes at a cost of, if you do standardized learning, if the goal is that everybody is taught to the same standard, you are going to leave more people behind, and the overall quality of education is diminished as a result. And that's what leads us into our next segment, is the question of, can you say that teachers should be paid more, that they should be better respected, and that we should hold them more accountable? Could you do all those things? And what would it look like? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
To teach or to educate? We've kind of been talking about both today, and really today is a story of the balance, I think, more than anything, and the fact that we are not achieving the balance. And the ultimate question that we started out is bad teaching tearing the U.S. apart? And here's my answer. I want to be real clear with people, and then Lance share his. Bad teaching is tearing the U.S. apart. That doesn't mean we have bad teachers. That is the distinction that we have to make. And that's kind of what leads us into this next idea here, right? Of, can I say I want higher wages for teachers, right? And I want more teacher accountability. Yes, I can say that. And here's what I mean by that. It should be easier to award and pay, like the professionals they are, the teachers that are worth every dime that we have to give them. It should also be easier to fire the teachers that are not doing a good job of serving kids. Yes, bad teaching is tearing us apart. It's not necessarily bad teachers. We have to do a better job of paying and rewarding good teachers, and we have to do a better job of not making it so difficult to get rid of the ones that are making it harder, not just for administrators and students, but for other teachers, because somebody's trying to pick up the slack. And it's not fair to ask the teachers that are that should be earning twice what they're making right now to make up for the teachers that are earning the same pay that they're making.
You just threw the bomb in the middle of the room. You know that. What you've done is you say, okay, we're going to take this experiment, and so now you're approaching it as a science. And as a science, we can grade everybody out on this graph, and based on how well you perform, this will then make all the decisions cut and dry. I can't honestly say I believe that, because in my 40 years as an educator and another 15, 20, well, be almost 25 years as a student, and no, I'm not that old, because like I said, multiple occasions I was both in the same calendar year. Education is an art. And how do you stand and look at a piece of artwork in the, New York Museum of Art and say, okay, this is a great one and this isn't? Well, you can't, I don't care what rubric you create. You can't do that. And that's what you're trying to do. Your plan is with teachers, is you're going to take an artistic job teaching and try to apply science to it to figure out who should get paid and who should be gotten rid of. And I don't know how you do that. It's going to take somebody smarter than me to figure that out. And then there are other pieces of art where you're going to say it's a great piece of art and I'm not. And half of people agree with you and half agree with me. So how do we know whether or not to get rid of it? And I'm just using those examples because that's what you're saying. And I just don't know how to do it. So if you've got some ideas, I'll comment on what your ideas are, but I don't think it's possible. I think it needs to be done, but I don't know how you get there. I don't know what factors you're going to use to make your decisions.
Part of what teachers, I think, recoil to, educators, when you start talking about accountability, is what they've become accustomed to is a system where we base teacher accountability on how their students perform on standardized tests. I wholeheartedly oppose the standardized test mentality of that's how we assess if we're doing a good job. Can you give a standardized test in something like multiplication tables? Yeah, you can standardize test that. Can you give a standardized test for problem solving skills? No, I don't think that that's realistic to say you're going to figure out a true way of determining if you have standardized problem solving. In part because it's a different process for everybody. What if the Board of Education, Lance, sets forward and says, these are the big picture goals of our district, right? These are the things that we strive to do as a school. And then they say, principals, you figure out your strategy for getting it done in your building with your age range. And then the principals say, here is what we are going to do, right? Here is how I am going to enable my educators to get to these goals. And then you let the educators figure out how to get it done.
That would be a better system if it actually worked that way. But you're not factoring in how many of my students are coming from a home where they're not safe. And how are you going to factor in those differences in everybody's classroom? Because sometimes, the best job and how do you factor that in to your system? And those are the things that, to me, you can't plug in an equation for what that value is to where is my student coming from? Mom and dad are sick.
I agree.
So now they're living with somebody else, or they live in a foster care situation, or they've had a traumatic experience. Dad was in a car accident on the day that we gave, the 2 days after we gave a test, and is in the hospital in a coma. How do you factor all of those in when you start trying to say, well, who's a good teacher and who's a bad teacher based on how their students perform?
No, I don't think it should be tied to how they perform. Just to be clear, I think that if we unshackle administrators from the constant paperwork burden, that your goal should be you have administrators that want to have regular weekly conversations, not meetings, conversations with their teachers so that they can get an idea of what's happening, so that they can decide just because these teachers' students aren't performing on these tests doesn't mean this teacher isn't doing a good job. Because this teacher has explained to me, here's all these things happening with my kids, and I'm focused on just getting them to do the work, let alone do it well, because they don't have an environment at home where they can even do the work.
But on the flip side, then, is that an excuse for the teacher?
Yeah.
Should the teacher find a way to get the job done anyway? And I know I'm talking on both sides, but that's what I do. I mean, you were in my classroom. That's what I take both sides of an issue and point out that how do you make that decision? And just because you as the administrator sit down and talk to me, I've known some teachers who can talk the talk, but when they get in their classroom, they don't walk the walk. I've been in classrooms where, oh my gosh, I want my child to have that teacher because that teacher is getting it done. But when you talk to that teacher, they can't express what it is that the administrator is looking to hear. So therein lies the rub as well. That still doesn't. And you can't say, okay, we'll put the administrators in the classroom. Unless they sit in my classroom every day for multiple weeks at a time, which means they're not sitting in the other rooms. They don't know what I'm doing. Or when my students are doing well, they feel comfortable enough to say, hey, Mr. Jackson, when you teach this lesson this way, that's when I really learn it. You have to develop a camaraderie with your students, a level of trust that takes time and takes a lot of work that has nothing to do with learning the facts to get them to start to perform and want to learn the things. Like sometimes you just look at them and say, you know what? This stuff isn't fun, but we got to do it. I don't even like this information, but we have to know this stuff. And then if you have that relationship with your students, then they buy into it. They're like, all right, even Mr. Jackson doesn't like to teach this lesson, but it's stuff that we're going to see later that we need to know. It's important in life. And so we're going to all work and pull together. You have to develop the relationship. And I don't know how you judge that and how you pay that, but that's the key to getting your students to perform on any level of test that you want to give them. Any evaluation you want is you as the teacher have to develop that relationship with your class.
And that's where, and this is what I know people don't like about this answer, is the human component that we can't, or at least haven't figured out how to put into words. You need administrators that have the ability to do what we want teachers to do with their students. We need administrators that can do that with their teachers. And we need to allow teachers the ability and the flexibility in their classroom to get the curriculum taught. Because at the end of the day, isn't that what we care about? Is equipping kids to be productive members of society. And really, why should we care so much about how it gets done, especially since we know not everybody does it the same way? And that's where I think you hear Lance and I go back to that whole, if we truly were able to return some control to the local level and actually give school boards, administrators, and teachers the ability to execute a vision, right? The way we measure it, right? The standardized test, folks, is not the test that they all sit down and take in 10th and 11th grade, right? Or whatever grade in your state they take it. That's not the test. The test is those numbers that we look at, right? Workforce productivity. How are we doing as a country? What do we know? How divided are we? How angry is our rhetoric? Those things, which unfortunately means you're measuring 20 years after you have tried something, right? Which is part of why we're just now starting to figure out that, oh, gee, this really isn't working. Not only are we not achieving what we want on our own standardized test, but we're also not achieving the societal goals. That's what we're looking at. And that's, I think, what today's show is about, is we're using the wrong goalposts. And until we readjust and rethink what we mean when we say accountability, what we mean when we say education and teach, we cannot fix these things. Let us know your thoughts. Email us, podcast@thestateofus.org. Email podcast@thestateofus.org. That's what we're trying to do today, right, Lance? Is educate, I think.
Yeah, just a quick shout out to all of those hardworking administrators and teachers out there who are trying to educate our young people. It is, on one hand, a thankless job, and on the other hand, it's the most rewarding job you can ever have. And I understand it very well. But yeah, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And again, I think we have done that. We've agreed on a lot of things. We've disagreed on a couple, but it's been honest and open. And hopefully you've enjoyed it, and you can share it with others and tell them, if they want to listen to us, that they can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
How might the world look differently if more classrooms were like the State of Us? We are a syndicated radio program and a podcast released by Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. in the Eastern time zone. So you can get the podcast then, all those places that Lance mentioned. On the weekends, you'll find us in talk radio markets across the country. Check your local talk station, see if they carry us. If they don't, call us up and tell them they should. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.